The House will come to order. For what purpose does the lady rise?
Mr. Speaker, point of personal privilege.
The lady from Freeborn, Representative Bennett.
Right. Mr. Speaker and members, I understand there's been a long-standing tradition for the District of 27A that started in 1995 with Representative Ron Kraus bringing dilly bars for a treat for the House. So I'm going to continue that tradition, and I have 200 dilly bars back there, though I understand they're shrinking right now. Both sides of the aisle, our staff, pages, please help yourself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate, Mr. Speaker. I hereby announce that the Senate has concurred in and adopted the report of the Conference Committee on Senate File Number 997, an act relating to insurance. The Senate has repassed said bill in accordance with the recommendation report of the Conference Committee. Message is signed Joanne Emshoff, Secretary of the Senate. The Conference Committee report is addressed to the Honorable Sandra L. Pappas, President of the Senate, the Honorable Kurt L. Doudt, Speaker of the House. We, the undersigned conferees for Senate File Number 997, report that we have agreed upon the items in dispute and recommend as follows. And the Conference Committee is signed by 3 conferees on part of the Senate and all 3 conferees on a part of the House. Schomacker moves that the report of the Conference Committee on Senate File Number 997 be adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee.
The gentleman from Rock, Chairman Schomacker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. My motion is to adopt the Conference Committee report. When we went to Conference Committee yesterday, this is the long-term care insurance bill that lowers the inflator protection from 3% to 1%. We were able to keep that language in there, the drop from 3% to 1%. We kept the House provision from Representative Atkins on the disability income coverage. We took a provision from the Senate regarding the long-term care insurance partnership policies that were in existence before July 1st of 2006. And we also found compromise language that the Department of Commerce and the industry and all the conferees could agree on from the changes in the Hoppe Amendment, so I would ask for your support.
Is there any discussion on the Conference Committee report? Discussion on the report. There being no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion to adopt the Conference Committee report on Senate File 997, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say nay. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its 3rd reading as amended by conference.
3rd reading, Senate File Number 997, as amended by conference.
3rd reading as amended by conference. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, the clerk will take, excuse me, Representative Mason, I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill does a lot to help encourage long-term care insurance, something that we should be having at the top of our list as we face an aging population. And I'm delighted that the discretionary clause is also addressed. I'll be voting no. I hope you will be too. Yes. I'm voting yes. Sorry about that. I'm thinking discretionary and we're against that. Again, please vote yes.
Further discussion to the conference report. The clerk will take the roll on the conference report.
We're at 11? You got to recognize Ward. Is she locked on?
The clerk will close the roll. Ward votes aye. There being 124 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by conference and its title is agreed to. Conference committee reports on House files.
Conference committee report on House File Number 1725, an act relating to state government. The report is addressed to the Honorable Kurt L. Doudt, Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Sandra L. Pappas, President of the Senate. We, the undersigned conferees, for House File Number 1725, report that we have agreed upon the items in dispute and recommend as follows. And the conference committee report is signed by all 3 members of the House and all 3 members of the Senate. Christensen moves that the report of the Conference Committee on House File Number 1725 be adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by Conference Committee.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Christensen.
Mr. Speaker, members, we got together, worked out a couple of clarifying amendments, clarifying our disputes in the language. This bill will bring the Office of Administrative Hearings into the 21st century and allow folks to submit forms electronically. I'd appreciate your support.
Is there any discussion on the Conference Committee report? Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Christensen yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Hortman.
Is this the bill that allows electronic filing at OAH, and if so, what changed from when it left the floor to when it's coming back from Conference Committee?
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Christensen.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Hortman, the Senate amended on some other provisions relating to agencies filing with the Office of Administrative Hearings. We were concerned about, in conference, about some of the provisions being a little bit broad, so we clarified the language a little bit in conference, and I think it's a good bill that's very clear.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Christensen.
Further discussion on adoption of the report. There being no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion to adopt the Conference Committee report on House File 1725 say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its third reading as amended by conference.
Third reading, Senate House File Number 1725, as amended by conference.
Third reading as amended by conference. Any further discussion? The clerk will take the roll on the report. Okay.
Oh, nice little platform.
The clerk will close the roll. Schoen votes aye. Lane votes aye. Lilly votes aye. There being 126 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by conference and its title agreed to. Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar for the day is Senate File 698. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File Number 698, number 3 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to natural resources.
The gentleman from Brown, Chairman Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. House File 390 is this year's version of the LCCMR bill, the Legislative Citizens for Minnesota Resources.
Thanks.
You should be getting some information on your desk shortly outlining some of the details of the bill. I will run through the overall titles and be happy to stand for questions. I will point out some of the changes that were made by the committee from the original recommendations. First, starting with the overall bill, there are a number of subdivisions. First, we have the foundational natural resource data and information.
Chair Torkelson.
Yes, sir.
There's an amendment at the desk. Do you wish to work on the amendment first, the DE amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That would be advisable.
There's an amendment at the desk.
Torkelson moves to amend Senate File number 698, the first engrossment as follows. Delete everything after the enacting clause and insert the following language of House File number 390, the second engrossment. The amendment is coded DEA 390.
The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the gentle reminder. The file, it started out as a Senate file. What the DE is the House file, the language that came out of the House committee, and we are going to replace the Senate language with the House file language. Mr. Chair, I would ask for a green vote on the DE amendment.
Discussion to the DE amendment to substitute the House language. The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Torkelson. So the Senate file that is coming over is the bill as it was generated by the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources, and it doesn't have any administrative changes. It doesn't have the changes that were made in the GOP majority House. The Senate bill is intact as it was recommended, I believe, unanimously by the LCCMR. Is that correct? If Representative Torkelson would yield.
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Hansen. You are correct. The version that came from the Senate does reflect the original recommendations of the Council. Some changes were made in House committee. The Senate neglected to make any improvements, but we did, and the DE reflects those improvements that were made by the House committee.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
And Mr. Speaker, maybe this is a parliamentary inquiry, but if we voted down this amendment, the Senate bill would remain as it was, and we could adopt the Senate bill, and it could go right to the governor, as was recommended by the LCCMR. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Mr. Speaker,
the gentleman from Dakota.
I'd ask for a roll call.
Roll call having requested are the 15 hands. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Lilly.
Mr. Speaker and members, I don't currently serve on this commission, but the projects that are put together were put together with a group of citizens, and I was one of the members at the time, and they were debated extensively and fought over, and battles were won and fought, and as provisions were put in, and I'm not saying that the ones that you're putting in are, every one of them's bad, but you know, one of them kind of stands out to me. It was like a little project for the kids, the college students at St. Thomas College were going to do a project on research on the turtles in Minnesota. And I know we're in a political place, and you know, a couple years ago we had the gorillas and the speakers sheet metal music museum, and that became political issues, and maybe that's why the turtles found another found it to the news, but or found the turtles didn't make it. But I wish that we'd stick to the Senate. I think that, you know, this is one of those cases where the clock really is ticking, and I don't know how much time we're going to get to do battle between the Senate and the House, and I would speak against this DE amendment.
Discussion to the DEA 390 amendment. Discussion. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. Liebling votes no. Carlson votes no. There being 73 ayes and 57 nays, the DEA 390 amendment is adopted. To the author, the gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll go back to where I was reviewing the bill. I'll start over with the first section. Foundational natural resource data and information includes 18 appropriations for a total of $12,932,000 and is 27.88% of the bill. The next section, the water resources section, includes 9 appropriations, $3,065,000 and 6.61% of the bill. Next subdivision, environmental education, $1,004,000, 2.16% of the bill. Next, aquatic and terrestrial invasive species projects, that is 4 appropriations for a total of $6,071,000 or 13.09% of the bill. Next subdivision, air quality, climate change, and renewable energy, $2,268,000, 4.89% of the bill. Next is methods to protect, restore, and enhance land, water, and habitat, 11 appropriations, $5,646,000, 12.17% of the bill. Next, land acquisition for habitat and recreation, $14,190,000, 30.59% of the bill. And finally, the last subdivision, administration and contract agreement reimbursement, 2 appropriations, 2.6% of the bill, $1,207,000. I thought it'd be wise if I did review the changes that were made in committee, Mr. Chair. There are a number of them. First, the turtle population dynamics in an urban lake project. That project was canceled and the money was moved to the Minnesota Biological Survey, line 3.21 of the bill. Next, the promotion of alternative ammunition to protect wildlife from lead poisoning was canceled and that money was moved to a new project, trap shooting sports facility grants. Next, the analysis of Minnesota energy systems to develop future energy strategies. That project was canceled, a $1 million project, and that fund was added to the acceleration of Minnesota conservation assistance final phase. Next, improving community forests through citizen engagement was originally a project of the PCA, is now being transferred to the DNR. The native prairie stewardship and prairie bank easement acquisition, to that language was added the conservation easement stewardship. It's a new account that will allow the agencies to properly fund the stewardship of the easements that the different agencies acquire. The same is true for the multi-benefit watershed scale conservation project on north central lakes. With that, Mr. Speaker, I think there may be some amendments at the desk.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Schultz moves to amend Senate File Number 698, first engrossment, and the amendment, as amended, and the amendment is coded A4.
The lady from St. Louis, Representative Schultz, to the A4 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment requires that land acquired from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund shall not be planted or treated with a product that contains a pollinator lethal insecticide like neonicotinoids. This isn't the first time I brought this amendment up, but it's even more relevant today. As you know, pollinators is the second biggest concern, environmental concern of people in Minnesota. And recently a survey was conducted by the University of Maryland. 6,000 beekeepers were surveyed, and they found that the losses in Minnesota were much greater than the national average, with a bee loss of 50% compared to a bee loss on average of 40%. Well, what's even more relevant is that there was a 38% bee loss in the summer months, something that they haven't seen before, an increase in bee loss in the summer months. So members, I urge you to support this amendment. We need our bees. They contribute to pollinating crops of over $15 billion. We need them for our food supply. And this insecticide harms their nervous systems, makes them weaker and more susceptible to pathogens like mites. So far, the majority party in the House, you have done nothing to protect the bees. All you've done is what was done in the last session, was to make sure we plant pollinator-friendly plants. That is not sufficient. So please, members, I urge you to vote green on this amendment, and I ask for a roll call.
Roll call. I'm going to request, are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Hansen moves to amend the Schultz amendment to Senate File 698 as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A5.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen, to the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The amendment to the amendment just adds in the restored and enhanced. So it's, again, we're only talking about trust fund acquired lands here, and then my amendment would be trust fund restorations or enhancements. So I would ask for a yes vote on this. It would be trust fund dollars. We're not talking about legacy dollars or any other dollars, just the lottery money, which is to protect the environment. So this would be adding restoration and enhancement funds.
Discussion to the Hansen amendment to the amendment. Discussion. The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my point will apply to both of these amendments and to a couple of more amendments that are coming. I would point members to subdivision 19 of the bill, pollinator and butterfly habitat. There's some general language here that is probably more inclusive and I think much more useful toward protecting the bees that are, of course, very important to all of us. And it reads, when feasible, a recipient of money appropriated in this section is encouraged to use conservation practices that promote butterfly and other pollinator habitat on land acquired in fee with money appropriated in this section, including planting and maintaining vegetation beneficial to butterflies and other pollinators, and minimizing, I stress that, minimizing the use of pesticides. Pollinators are, of course, important to all of us, but one of the major problems with pollinators is they just don't have enough to eat. Supplying the right kind of plants so that they can eat well will help them be healthy and survive. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge members to make up their own minds on how to vote on these amendments.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Torkelson, I believe Representative Schultz referenced that in 2013 we did pass a statutory change to allow for improved habitat. And so, and I've got the statute here. As soon as I'm done, I'm going to send that out to everybody so we can see what's already in current law. I think that and that applies not just to the trust fund. The current law applies to all lands. So that helps out pollinators by providing the plantings. Where we're going here is only on the trust fund, and it's relating to, with this amendment, restoration and enhancement. So I would ask for a roll call on the restoration and enhancement.
Roll call. I'm going to request on the amendment to the amendment. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call on the amendment to the amendment. Further discussion on the Hansen amendment to the amendment. The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I'm looking at the language that's in the bill right now regarding pollinator habitat, and it says that when feasible, the recipient of the money should be encouraged to use conservation practices that promote pollinator habitat. And I guess I'm wondering if Chair Torkelson would yield as to how he would expect that kind of encouragement would be given to minimize the use of pesticides, as opposed to simply requiring a recipient of the money as is proposed in the amendment.
The gentleman from Brown will yield. The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The proper use of licensed pesticides are important tools in establishing habitat and protecting the plants that these pollinators survive on. Most of this work is done by our state experts in the DNR and Bowser, and so this language encourages them to do the right thing, which they should be doing anyway. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Ramsey. The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to follow up, Representative Pinto, federal law requires labeling on a pesticide, and a pesticide can be an herbicide or insecticide. And what the federal government is requiring the registrants or the manufacturers to do is to put a B box on there if it would kill or harm. So there you have on the label information for the applicators. And so we can choose not to buy that as a state, and so you're not in the choice of having bought it and deciding where to use it. And we can just have the clear information right now with this, and I'd encourage a green vote on my amendment.
Further discussion to the Hansen amendment to the amendment. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 70 ayes and 60 nays, the amendment to the amendment is adopted. To the amendment as amended. Discussion. The lady from St. Louis, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I ask for a green vote. Remember, this is important to the agriculture producers in our state. They need pollinators. Thank you.
Further discussion to the amendment as amended. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment as amended. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 86 ayes and 43 nays, the amendment as amended is adopted. There are no other amendments to the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File Number 698, as amended.
Any further discussion on the bill as amended? The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know if this is to Representative Torkelson or Representative McNamara. We had in committee there was some changes relating to hiring, and I'm not quite sure where that is in the bill or the bill as it has been amended. Can you, Representative Torkelson, could you maybe explain the change in the hiring process and what that means, if you would yield?
He will yield. The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hansen, for those members who are following the bill, it's on line 41.31 in section 7 of the bill. The change here is that instead of the council members making the hiring decision on executive director and other employees, we would move that responsibility to the Legislative Coordinating Commission. They do this service for a number of other bodies here in the legislature. As all of you know, the hiring and firing practice has become quite organized and restrictive as to what questions you can ask and what questions you shouldn't ask. Having a citizens board do this not only puts them at some risk, it puts the legislature at some risk. If this is handled by the professionals at the LCC, that removes that risk, and this hiring practice is done in a professional manner as it is done for a number of other organizations. Recently, when the Legislative Water Commission was formed, we used the LCC to go through that process, and the process went very smoothly without any problems, but still had input from the members of that commission. There was also a recent hiring process with the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Commission that perhaps didn't go quite as smoothly, although the results seem to have turned out just fine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Hansen.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if Representative Torkelson would yield for one more question.
The gentleman from Brown will yield. The gentleman from Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Torkelson, did the commission, I'm just wondering about the process of this coming about. If the commission voted or asked for this, I know there was some issues in the past, so I'm just wondering if this was a request from the citizens and the members on there, or if it had where it was coming from, if there was ever a vote on the commission. Just a little bit of authority questions there, Representative Torkelson.
The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Representative Hansen and members. This was not a request of the commission, but it does fit with some other legislative initiatives to clean up this process throughout the Minnesota House of Representatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I just wanted to say a couple additional words. There was a great group of citizens that were doing these proposals, and legislators, including Chair Torkelson, did great work, and the staff, some of them are in the back there, did a really nice job in setting up tours around the state and made it. It's really a fascinating thing. I hope you take, when you get a little time, maybe during the break, take a look at some of these projects. And there's some really neat science and neat ideas. This is lottery money, and it's kind of going to some kind of interesting, kind of fun stuff. But so earlier I just got up and I spoke about, mostly it was about the process that we chose to do, and there are some changes that I'm not, totally against. It's just like the shooting. I think some of the money's going to shooting sports, and I just wish it would have went through the process. And then I wanted to speak just. Representative Erickson asked me a little bit more, and some others, about the turtles, and so it was basically at St. Thomas was going to do a project related to turtles, and what turtles are kind of indicator in the water is it's kind of like the canaries in the mine. It kind of tells you what the water quality is. So that's what they were going to study and that sort of thing. So. And then keep in mind, much of the money just goes to the University of Minnesota and some of the bigger institutions. So this was an opportunity to have some of the money go to a smaller institution, and the commission all supported that. But at the end, my big thing is I hope we can pass this, because there's a lot of good work that we can get it done. So Chair Torkelson, get to work, and I wish we would have stuck with the Senate, but good luck.
Further discussion, the lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too was a member of this commission when this package was voted on, and so I wanted just to add a few words to what you've already heard, because the commission is different than some of the other citizen advisory groups we have. It's made up of a lot of scientists. And instead of just voting on projects, folks are invited in to make a presentation, half an hour, and those projects are gone over with a fine-tooth comb. But after the fine-tooth comb, there is a consensus process. So the package that originally came to this legislature was designed by consensus. Where have you heard that word before in this legislature? Designed by consensus and voted on by consensus. That's why I was so surprised to see that the Environment Committee took some of the money to pay for pet projects. And in this time of surplus, it seemed to me that respecting the work of the citizens would have been wise. They put in an enormous number of hours, and we had a budget surplus, so those pet projects could have been funded otherwise. What is in this bill, beside the pet projects, are quite good, and I would urge members to vote for the bill and hope that when it comes back, the pet projects are gone and we have the consensus package of the citizen legislative members.
Discussion to the bill as amended. The gentleman from Wabasha, Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, here we go again. Another LCCMR bill that comes before us, as happens seemingly year after year. We have another $14 million of the people's money being spent to buy more land and place it in control of state government. Now, we saw the legacy bill, Mr. Speaker, happen earlier. And in that bill, we purchase about 10 or 11,000 acres of state land every single year. And in this bill, we've got another 1,000 or, no, there's a couple thousand or more acres of land in this bill that are encumbered by state government, using the people's money to take the land off the tax rolls, further complicating local units of government and their ability to properly pay for the services in their area, complicating the property tax system, shifting property tax responsibility onto those other parcels of land. Members, vote no.
Further discussion, the gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I was prepared to say no for this bill, but considering that the body has taken a bipartisan support of pollinators here on a pretty strong number, maybe Mr. Speaker, if Representative Torkelson would yield for a question.
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Torkelson, sometimes when things go into conference that pass here, they kind of fall on the floor and are forgotten. And I just wanted to ask you about how strongly you would support the House position going into negotiations with the Senate.
The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hansen, the path for this bill is somewhat uncertain because of the late date that it is being passed off the floor. I will certainly do what I can for the House position. As you know, my personal vote on it was red which I guess might affect my judgment a little bit.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, the similar discussion we had on legacy was looking at the recommendations that come from a council or a commission, and we've gone back and forth depending on who's in power and what we agree with. But I think the changes that were made in this bill we have spoken about when we took the vote on the first DE. I think the Senate provisions that were recommended in terms of the projects were good. I would hope that the body would go back, or the conference committee would go back for those. I think there is a difference between the LCCMR and the Outdoor Heritage Council. The Outdoor Heritage Council did have from the beginning authority with the LCC working through and working with the Citizens Commission, but I would agree that that last process did not work very well. The LCCMR, though, the authority for being with the commission to do the hiring has been there from the beginning. So as with many bills, there are some good things and bad things. I'm a little concerned, Representative Torkelson, on your red vote, but I do think it's important for this legislature to move forward on pollinators and to get that into conference and hopefully make a step I think is worth a yes vote.
Further discussion. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Representative Hansen made one distinction between the LOHC and these dollars, which Representative Duszkowski is urging you to vote against because we're spending the people's money. That's true. And in this case, the people made a choice to play the lottery knowing that 40% of the money was actually going to go for the very thing we're spending money on here. Yes, in this case, the people did make a choice, and this is the choice they made.
Discussion. The gentleman from Brown, Chair Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am assuming that we are near the end of discussions on the bill. Before we wrap things up, I would like to make sure that I point out the good work of the folks at the LCCMR that are the employees there that do such fine work, not only scheduling our tours and helping us with all the materials we need, but also carefully administering and monitoring the various projects LCCMR is involved with. They are constantly monitoring these folks that are spending the state's money, and they do a fine job of that, and I would like to thank them and congratulate them for that. Director Susan Thornton and employees Mike Banker, Michael McDonough, and Diana Griffith all do great work down there in the corner. If you're ever wandering around the SOB and want to stop in and say hello, I'm sure they'd love to chat with you. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to note that these are that the product of the LCCMR are recommendations to the legislature. They are not orders or directives, and there is a past history of making changes in those recommendations based on knowledge that comes from the legislature. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to urge a green vote on this year's LCCMR bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 100 ayes and 30 nays, the bill as amended is passed and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 748. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 748, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to disaster assistance.
The gentleman from Scott, Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House File 748 is the disaster relief bill that I spoke of on this floor a number of months ago. I have to, before I get into some very Spartan comments, thank some folks that were very helpful along the way in vetting the projects, as well as making sure that we conformed with both Chapter 12A and 12B of the statutes. Along the way, we were helped by Mr. Kent Lockasmo, Al Keene, and Director Kelly from Homeland Security, and we were certainly assisted in our efforts to make sure this was a meaningful bill by those counties and municipalities that are affected. Members, it would go without saying that we've been waiting a long time for this bill, literally 11 months. And that came about for a number of reasons. First, it was actually the first time that both Chapter 12A and 12B were actually put into process. And before I forget, I'd like to thank the author and the sister of those two chapters, Representative Pawlowski. In the past number of days, he's been very, very helpful to myself personally, as well as to a number of others in terms of appreciating the process that was undertaking and making sure that this bill conformed to what the intent of those two chapters was. And now, while the new chapters were inclusive in terms of process, I think that it's fair to say that the outcome from hearing from both the counties as well as the various agencies is there's some work to still be done in refining the process. And I look forward to working with Representative Pawlowski on that measure over the next coming months. That being said, members, this is the disaster relief bill that conforms to the start, which was 8 counties. It's now 36 counties and 3 tribal governments. It was improved or increased in over 4 various increments, and it does conform with the the governor's declaration, as it were. It's a long and protracted process, but I think that you'll find that we have done our due diligence on the projects in the bill, and I would encourage a favorable green vote on the bill. Thank you.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 748.
Third reading. The gentleman from Winona, Representative Pawlowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support House File 748 and to remind the body that this is the first time we have operated on a disaster without a special session when we have not been in session. Chapters 12A and 12B went into effect as a result of the 2014 session, and there were 2 issues that came up when Representative Albright and I met Tuesday, first in his office in the morning and then secondly in the afternoon, with all of the agencies that he has already given credit to. These disasters trigger with 2 events. The first is a presidential declaration. The second is a gubernatorial declaration of a disaster. Previously, we had the trigger as a special session. There seems to have been some confusion, and particularly with the local units of government, as to when the trigger began. That confusion is now being clarified, as Representative Albright said. Secondly, FEMA, which is a federal agency, has also been very difficult to deal with. It has been recalcitrant in giving us how it would abdicate its money and resources, and then it has been actually a little bit late in telling us what it would be. But I want to emphasize one other thing that Representative Albright said. We should never have 2 disaster bills again as a result of a disaster that has occurred outside of a regular session. There should be one bill, it should be inclusive, and that should be it for the totality of what the state of Minnesota is going to spend on a disaster. So I too look forward to working with Representative Albright to ensure that in the future there is clarity on how Minnesota will address a disaster when it is not in session and chapters 12A and 12B are put into effect.
Discussion to the bill. Gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Albright, it's my understanding that there's going to be some discussion tonight about disaster relief and Ways and Means. The budget or the agenda sets up an amendment to the budget resolution, and I'm just trying to look at the numbers with the numbers that you're carrying in this bill, and there's a little bit more than 14 million remaining on the bottom line in Ways and Means under the House budget resolution, which we're still operating under. And so how will those bills interact so that they fit within the budget resolution? And maybe if you want to defer Representative Albright to the chair of Ways and Means, maybe that's the better person to ask. I selected you first as the chief author of this bill, but you won't be the chief author probably of the second bill. So maybe, Mr. Speaker, I would rather have the chair of Ways and Means, Representative Knobloch, yield.
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Mr. Speaker,
the gentleman from Stearns, Chair Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Carlson, we had previously changed the budget resolution to allow for the dollars that are on House File 748 here on the floor some weeks ago. And so this bill is in compliance with the budget resolution. If we were to bring a different bill forward that had some mix of financing, I would anticipate that we'd be spending the same dollars twice, and the language would be the same twice on at least a portion of the bill, and so it would not be in violation of the budget resolution. As you know, there is a possible budget resolution change set for Ways and Means tonight, and we aren't still quite sure in these last quick waning days of the session exactly what that will be, but we certainly have the option of changing that as well.
And
the gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Representative Knobloch, as we both know, there are ways that when you spend money twice that can be carried in the language, but essentially my question was, on the face of it, at least at this point in time, you would only have 14.5 remaining on the bottom line. And if you have, I guess, the appropriate language about spending money twice, what I call the Bill Marks Amendment, then it may work. But you will have then just the 14.5 on the bottom line after this passes, if I recall correctly.
Is the gentleman from Hennepin asking the gentleman from Stearns to yield? The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And would Representative Albright yield for a question?
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Dakota.
Representative Albright, this bill has a number of funds relating to the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and there have been some questions about funds going to private land for conservation practices. Could you just explain kind of the precedent that we have there and what's the reason for that?
The gentleman from Scott, Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hansen, the funding appropriated in the bill is for grants to private landowners who are adjacent to public lands to bring them back to the position they were prior to the damage created by a public outlet in some cases, or to remediate the situation so that no further damage could be caused by another rain event.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I believe we've done that before on previous disasters.
as Representative Plowski noted, this is the second disaster bill during this session. And when we look at the history, and if those of you who are interested in the history of special sessions, you could look at the Legislative Auditor's report on response to disasters. And the number of disasters and the cost for disasters has increased since the turn of the century. The amount of money that we will be appropriating for this, now that we've set precedent, is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. A week ago or 2 weeks ago, we had a reference with the 50th anniversary of the Fridley tornado. Just think of some of those major historical natural disasters that we have had in the history of our state, and if they occurred now. Now, back 50 years ago, we didn't have a disaster fund like we do now. We didn't have the precedent that we had to go into special session. But I think looking at the long term here, we are going to have to set aside a significant amount of money. It's likely that we are going to have more disasters. They are going to be increasing in their frequency and in their cost. And whatever people believe about the reason for those disasters, I think that our recent past is going to show us that the cost is going to be there for the public. So we're going to have to spend a little more time on this in the future, rather than just setting aside maybe 10 million or 20 million. There's going to be a lot of money that is going to be spent in Minnesota in the future on disaster response.
Further discussion to the bill? The clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 129 ayes and 2 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is Senate File 1694. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File number 1694, number 1 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to public safety.
The gentleman from Anoman, Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a question. Oh, never mind, I don't. Okay. No, this is the religious objections to autopsies bill. This came to us in March. We've been working on it for 2 months. This going through the bill, it's basically going to require medical examiners or coroners to have a policy to help explain in the event of a death to the family of decedents. There was some issues earlier this year with a medical examiner who ignored a court order to release the body, and this bill, I think, has gone into great depth to fix that problem. We are not changing much current law. The reasons for doing an autopsy are the same. This deals with only a discretionary autopsy, and if on religious grounds a family member will file for a release of the body, then if the medical examiner decides he still wants to do an autopsy, it will be up to him to go to the courts to get that permission. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would just ask for a green vote.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File Number 1694.
Third reading, discussion to the bill. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I speak in favor of the bill. I just want to briefly emphasize what this bill doesn't do, and then just explain a little bit about what it does do. And under this bill, the medical examiner retains complete discretion in the first instance to determine the extent of the coroner's or medical examiner's investigation, including whether there's going to be an additional investigation, whether jurisdiction is going to be assumed, or whether an autopsy will be performed. This discretion is subject to the right of the representative of the decedent to object to the autopsy. And there was some question about who that representative is and whether this proposed bill alters that under current law, and the answer is no. If you look at the bill, it makes a reference to section 149A.80, which defines representative, and it's basically just determined by a directive, by a will, and it gives a priority of persons who can assert control or the right to control disposition of a body. So as Representative Green stated, if the representative of the decedent objects to the autopsy, then it cannot be performed unless the medical examiner determines that there is a compelling state interest to perform the autopsy. And what this proposed bill does is it defines compelling interest, and it's basically 14 different interests, police power, law enforcement, public health. Those are set out in the statute. And then there is one provision where if the coroner believes there's a compelling interest and is not described in the bill, then the coroner can go and file an action and go to district court and get an order to conduct the autopsy, notwithstanding the religious objection. So what does this bill do? It basically keeps families out of court by eliminating the need to get a court order to stop a discretionary autopsy which violates their religious beliefs. It shifts the burden from the families to the state, and for that reason it is a reasonable balance between state interests and religious freedom. So I want to thank Representative Green for carrying this bill and all the work done on this bill, and I think it could be a model bill, and so please vote green. Thank you.
Further discussion, the lady from St. Louis, Representative Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Green yield for a question?
The gentleman will yield. The lady from St. Louis, Representative Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Green, I was looking under current law what some of the reasons are that a coroner or medical examiner can conduct an autopsy, and then looking under some of the new definitions under what is a compelling state interest for when a medical examiner can conduct an autopsy after somebody has raised a religious objection. And some of those reasons were left out. Just a couple examples: unexplained or unexpected perinatal or postpartum maternal deaths, stillbirths or deaths of newborn infants in which there has been maternal use or exposure to unprescribed controlled substances, including street drugs, or which there is a history or evidence of maternal trauma. And there's a few others under current law that are not considered compelling state interests if a religious objection has been raised. And I was just wondering if you could explain to me why those are left out, and if there's some sort of language that allows for autopsies in those cases if a religious objection has been raised.
The gentleman from Monoman, Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Moline. As it was explained to me, the existing law is not voided in this bill. And so the existing law is still there. And there were some things that were changed in this as this went through the process. And what we were trying to do was get language that everybody could be happy with, because we had some concerns with the medical examiners and also the county attorneys. And so over the last few months, we have, and I'll thank them, I'll thank the medical examiners and the county attorneys and also the Minnesota tribes, because they came together and they worked hard on this, and this is what they came up with, and I trust that they have got a deal that they are satisfied with.
The lady from St. Louis, Representative Moline.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Green, yes, that's my understanding as well, that existing law will remain. And under existing law, if nobody raises a religious objection, then a medical examiner can do an autopsy to try to explain an unexplained or unexpected postpartum maternal death, or a stillbirth of newborn infants in which there's been maternal use or exposure to drugs or evidence of maternal trauma. That remains if somebody has not raised a religious objection. But under your definitions under compelling state interest, that is not considered a compelling state interest for being able to conduct an autopsy if somebody has raised a religious objection. And I'm just wondering why some of these things were left out, and I have concerns that we as a state will not be able to gather enough information on why a woman died during childbirth or shortly thereafter, and why an infant was possibly stillborn if there was a history of drug abuse or violence against the mother. And I just want members to be aware that those aren't exceptions under the new compelling state interest, and that concerns me. Additionally, will Representative Green yield for another question?
The gentleman will yield. The lady from St. Louis, Representative Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Green, and actually Representative Allen touched a little bit on this about who the representative of the deceased is. And my question is in regard if a child under the age of 18 passes away, and that child has two parents that share joint legal custody. Because under Minnesota law, if you share joint legal custody, then you're both entitled to have a say in the religious upbringing of your child. From my understanding, only one of those parents under this proposal has to raise a religious objection to an autopsy. And my question is, what if the other parent who has legal custody of their child, and by definition under state law, they have a right to influence their religious upbringing, what if that parent wants an autopsy done of that child, but the other parent, who also has joint legal custody, objects? What is the recourse for that parent that wants an autopsy of their deceased child?
The gentleman from Anoman, Representative Green.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Moline, my understanding is that if a religious objection is raised and the medical examiner chooses to move ahead with an autopsy anyway under his discretion, he has the option then to go into district court and appeal for that autopsy. And I believe that that's how this will work.
The lady from St. Louis, Representative Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Green, if you'll yield again.
The gentleman will yield. Representative Moline.
My question is, if one parent raises a religious objection and the coroner doesn't decide that there's a compelling state interest and doesn't do an autopsy, but the other parent, who also has legal custody of the child, does not raise a religious objection and wants an autopsy done, what mechanism does that parent have to have an autopsy done of their child?
The gentleman from Anoman, Representative Green.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Moline, I would assume that that person then could go into the law as it's read here and petition for that if he so chooses. We have our courts set up that way. I would have to believe that with the medical examiners and the county attorneys, when they were looking this over, had considered that, and this would cover that. If someone chooses to object on a religious grounds, they can do that, and if the examiner chooses to deny that, then he has the option to go to district court and apply for the autopsy anyway.
The lady from St. Louis, Representative Moline.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Green, thank you for that. Those are a couple of things that I want to clear out. I do think that that creates a little bit of a problem because under Minnesota law, if you have joint legal custody, you should both have a say in the religious upbringing of your child, but under these new exceptions, only one parent has to raise the objection, and the mechanism for the other parents then is to have to go to court. So technically they would be treated unequally when under law they're supposed to have equal upbringing of their child's religious beliefs. And then I just want to mention the last part about this bill that I have some concerns on, and I won't ask you to yield, but members, if you look on lines 5.5 to 5.10, the way that the religious objection to an autopsy is now set up, the coroner medical examiner notifies the family that they intend to do an autopsy. The family then has 24 hours to make a religious objection to that autopsy. The coroner then asks the family to submit affidavits stating their relationships to the deceased person, religious affiliation of the deceased person, and basically evidence that the deceased person had religious beliefs that would cause an objection to an autopsy. The medical examiner then reviews evidence of whether or not that person had these religious beliefs and then decides if there's a compelling state interest for an autopsy. To me, that creates a conflict. First of all, you have a person who is not an independent party basically deciding whether or not somebody's religious beliefs are valid and then deciding whether or not there's a compelling state interest. What I would like to see is to first decide whether or not there's a compelling state interest and then find out if somebody has a religious objection, and then there could be some other mechanism to try to resolve that. But, members, judges at least take an oath of office that they're going to be impartial in their decision making, and I think that's why a lot of these decisions are left up to the court. And have a medical examiner review whether or not somebody's religious beliefs are basically valid and then decide whether or not there's a compelling state interest to do an autopsy. I just see a real conflict in how that is set up under the bill. And I would say that this rose from a dispute in northeastern Minnesota, and I think the intention of this bill is very well intended, and I do think it is something that we needed to address at the legislature, but unfortunately sometimes we are reactionary, and I wish we could have taken a little bit more time on crafting this correctly, because I think there's going to be some unintended consequences here, and I'm just not sure that we should have the medical examiner deciding whether or not somebody has legitimate religious objections and then deciding if there's a compelling state interest. Deciding whether or not there's a compelling state interest should come before that. And I do have some concerns with the other pieces that were left out of the definition of compelling state interest, the ones that I mentioned earlier regarding stillbirths of mothers who have a history of drug abuse or violence, and also postpartum maternal deaths. We gather really important information on that to try to figure out statistics just statewide of how many cases we have of that each year, but also why it's happening. And unfortunately, I don't see that that would be allowed under the compelling state interest if somebody has raised a religious objection. So I'm not going to ask people to vote one way or another on this. I think it's a very a bill with a lot of really great intentions, but I just see a lot of problems, and I wish we could have taken a little bit more time on this before passing it this session. So thank you, members.
The gentleman from Blue Earth, Chair Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, this is a great bill that went through my committee. Representative Allen, you'll have to say hi to that charming Native American woman that gave that stirring testimony. Kind of a hush fell over the room. You could hear a pin drop. She did a very good job talking about the trials and tribulations she went through. Also, we had Representative Hillstrom sat in that committee, Representative Schoen, so we got a prosecutor, a cop, Representative Winkler, an attorney. We had a city councilman, Representative Considine, and we had a lot of time and listened and asked questions. There was law enforcement and prosecutors in the room. Nobody had a problem. It flew through. I think it's a great bill, and I would ask for a green vote. Thank you.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just wanted to address a couple of the points that Representative Moline was making. And I appreciate that she's, as an attorney, on her feet to come up with hypotheticals and to question. And so the good questions. I think there's some misunderstanding about the representative, the decedent, because this bill does, I think that line of inquiry to Representative Green is not relevant, because this bill does not change who has the right to control the decedent, to dispose of the body, or that's all determined by 149A. And if you look at 149A, it talks about priority of persons. First it would be determined by a decedent's directive or a will, but then it has a priority of persons, a spouse. And so it does address your scenario there about joint custody. I believe that is adequately addressed. And so this bill does not change that. And I think there's also some confusion about that this compelling interest, it's basically, I mean, it is a legislative function to impose standards regarding a balancing test when you're dealing with constitutional rights and state interests. And so that compelling interest is not, if you look at on G, it says what I spoke to earlier was that if the coroner or medical examiner determines there is a compelling state interest to perform an autopsy under circumstances not described in Clause A, then they can bring an action to obtain an order to proceed with the autopsy. So this does not in any way remove impede the investigation or prosecution or prevent autopsies where there's suspicion of foul play or where that public health is threatened. I mean, any type of scenario you could come up with, if that can be established, if within the discretion of the medical examiner can get a court order to do that. So I wanted to point that out, and I think Representative Liebling had a...
The lady from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also appreciate the fact that Representative Moline is looking at the bill. I wasn't on any of the committees that heard this either, and I think it's very interesting, and I think it's a very important part of this process that members on the House floor take a look, no matter how many people have given it the stamp of approval. So I think it's a very important conversation, but I was looking at the language, Representative Moline, and I like the idea of what this bill is doing very much. In fact, it's a little bit surprising to me that in the past that we haven't had something like this, because I know we do have a lot of religious communities that don't appreciate an autopsy, and the idea that one would be done over their objection is really quite surprising and troubling. But I'm looking at, Representative Moline, part of the language you were referring to on 5.3 about the coroner or medical examiner sort of getting to decide in the first instance if somebody has a valid religious objection. And I'm not reading it that way, and I wonder, maybe I could ask Representative Green to yield and see if he's reading it this way, because what I'm understanding this to say is that a representative of the decedent can object, and then it says quite clearly, an autopsy must not be performed unless the coroner or medical examiner determines there's a compelling state interest. Then it goes on to say that that person can require this affidavit, but it doesn't say they get to decide whether the objection is valid. It just says they can require the affidavit. So as I'm reading this, the coroner does not get to decide if it's a valid religious objection, and if he did, I'd be concerned about that, like Representative Moline is, but it appears to me all that person gets to decide is, okay, I've been given the affidavit. Now, if I still think there's a compelling state interest, then I go to court. So I don't think there's a problem there, Representative Moline, but I guess I'm asking Representative Green to yield, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Monoman, Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Green, is that how you understand this, that the coroner gets to ask for an affidavit, but if there is one, if the person says, I have a religious objection, the coroner does not get to say, no, you don't, you're making it up?
The gentleman from Monoman.
Mr. Speaker, that is the way I read it, and that is really, it takes in the whole compass of the bill, because that's the language that was cloudy in the first place. In the current language in law, it simply said that the coroner has total discretion over all of it. And if the family then had an objection, it was up to them to go to court and try to stop it. And in the law, the way that it was read is that even if a court order was obtained by the family, the coroner did not have to obey that court order, and that's what happened in the counties that we were talking about.
Representative Liebling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Green. And Representative Moline, I'm listening with interest if you have other concerns, but I think at this point I don't see anything that would stop me from voting for the bill.
Further discussion? Clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll.
Just teasing.
There being 128 ayes and 3 nays, Senate file number 1694 is passed and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is Senate file 1215. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate file number 1215, number 1 on the supplemental calendar for the day, an act relating to health.
The gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Senate file 1215 is the prohibition of flame retardant chemicals used in some children's and household goods. This has been probably the toughest bill I've worked on in a long time here. I wouldn't say it's that there's peace in the valley on this. I would more inclined to call it a ceasefire and peace talks will resume. This has been a lot of work. What it does is it does ban 4 flame retardant chemicals, and it requires a report due by the 16th, January 16th. So we can take a look at that report and see if there's further work to do. I appreciate the support and all the work. We've met hours and hours of meetings to get this bill to this stage. So I appreciate the support on both sides of the aisle, and that's the bill, my friends.
There are no amendments to the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate file number 1215.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill, the gentleman from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By the way, I realized as I got here today that I had my red shirt on. I didn't actually do that because it was for the firefighters, but I took note, Mr. Speaker, that you're also wearing all black today, and the back row over here has figured that's because you're grieving your tax bill. But don't stop believing, Mr. Chairman. I really mean that. I got a provision in your tax bill, so I'm hoping that something comes of that. Representative Howe, thank you for, well, thank you. Representative Howe, thank you for the bill. I was, when I saw Representative Winkler's son here today, he's about 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, I realized that my dad was mayor of Inver Grove. Mayor of Inver Grove, the city was about 6,000 people back then, pretty small town, and we had kind of a crisis going on in Inver Grove. There was an agreement between the firefighters in the city and the local railroad, or national railroad that ran through Inver Grove, that when they set grass fires and the firefighters put them out, the fire department could bill the railroad and they'd get the bill paid. And that worked well for years until a problem happened, which is the railroad stopped paying. And so the city sent a letter off to the railroad, and nothing happened. The city sent another letter from their lawyer, and nothing happened. The lawyer called the railroad, and the lawyer for the railroad said, we ain't going to pay anymore. And the lawyer threatened to sue them from the city, and the lawyer for the railroad said, well, go ahead. We got more money than you got, and you know, this will go on forever. It's worth a lot more to you to just leave us alone. And so then my dad, new mayor of Inver Grove, he said, well, I'll call him. I'll get this straightened out. So he called the railroad. And the railroad told my dad to go and get lost. So my dad decided, new mayor that he was, he didn't know any better, but he talked to the fire chief, and they decided on a different course of action because the lawsuit would be too expensive. What they did was when the train came through the town and came to a stop in Inver Grove, my dad had the fire chief, a pretty nervous new fire chief, pull one fire rig out across the tracks behind the train and another fire rig out across the tracks in front of the train. And they parked them there and took the keys out of the ignition. And the railroad got a little angry, and their lawyer called the city's lawyer. And the city's lawyer said, well, you better talk to the mayor. And so the lawyer for the railroad talked to my dad, and my dad quoted the railroad's lawyer and told him he could go and get lost and sue him if he wanted to get paid or get the fire rigs off the railroad. And lo and behold, within a couple of days, all the bills got paid for the grass fires. They moved the fire rigs off the rail line, and ever since then, the city of Inver Grove's been paid for grass fires that are fought along the rail line. And I remember I was like about Edward's age, Representative Winkler's son. I asked my dad, why was that such a big deal? And to this day, this is now 35 years later, I still remember what my dad said. He said, son, when it comes to firefighters, he said, everybody else runs from danger, but firefighters run towards it. And he said, if you ever get a chance to stand up for firefighters, you do it. This, folks, is your day to stand up for firefighters. And Representative Howe, I appreciate you bringing this bill. It takes on 4 chemicals that are causing cancer in firefighters. We know that to be the case. There's 6 more. And Representative Howe, I don't think the bill goes quite far enough, and I don't think you do either. But you've laid the path for further study on those 6. And it's not going to go off for years and years, but it's going to go till January. And by the time we get back here in March, I hope that we're going to have that sort of information so we can tackle those next 6 chemicals that are causing cancer in firefighters. By the way, that fire chief that was pretty nervous about parking the fire rigs across the railroad track, I met his daughter at about the same time, and she's now my wife. So, if I don't support firefighters, shoot, folks, I can't even go home. But Representative Howe, it's a great bill. I applaud all your efforts. Sorry to Representative Pepin, who I don't see on the floor, for my being such a pain in her rear end for the last 2 weeks, asking for suspension of the rules and parliamentary inquiries. But, you know, if you want to blame somebody, blame my dad. He was willing to park fire rigs across rail lines to protect firefighters and help firefighters. So it's a good outcome. I hope everybody votes green.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if Representative Howe would yield to a couple questions.
The gentleman will yield. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Howe, my understanding is that the original bill had a ban of 10 different chemicals and something involving carpets and upholstery, and that the revised bill bans 4 chemicals and doesn't deal with carpets and upholstery. Is that an accurate summary?
Gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
That is an accurate summary, but keep in mind that the 10 chemicals that started with were kind of boilerplate language that came out. And as we went through it, there was actually 3 out of those 10 chemicals that were determined not to be used in the products that we were discussing. And then so we were down to 3 chemicals that we still believe need further look at. And so you're right, we couldn't get the carpet padding in that we discussed, and we still have some upholstered furniture that we need to look at. And we should have that study in January so we can address that next year.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So Representative Howe, and I really respect the work that you've put into this. So does that mean that some of the chemicals that we were trying to get rid of, we already know that they're carcinogens when they're burning, but we can't get rid of them at this time in this draft of the bill?
The gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Hortman. I believe we suspect them. There's some information out there. They have not been banned in any other state. It would have kind of put us as an outlier a little bit, but I do believe they're definitely suspected. I actually pushed very hard to get more. I think we're as far as we can go. The NIOSH reports and that should be available to us before January. I believe we can take a look at that, and hopefully we can make further progress.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Howe. I didn't want to just stand up and criticize the bill without acknowledging the effort that you've put into it. I really respect the work that you did as a firefighter, and that Representative Simonson still does. And I give a lot of credence to what firefighters have to say about what they would see happen, because when I'm trying to leave my house, if it's on fire and I fall down, they're coming in to get me. And so I'm inclined to listen to them about what they want to be burning and not burning in my house when that happens. And I'm disappointed that we couldn't do more. I think that we had support in the House to do more, and there was support in the Senate to do more. And I hope that this is a first step that isn't the end of the conversation, and that it's not really, you know, as some firefighters feel, like caving in to companies that have a financial interest. I think we always do better to listen to the men and women who protect us in firefighting and law enforcement than companies who are looking after their bottom line. So thank you for your work.
The gentleman from Beltrami, Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of the bill. And just a couple of things. Representative Howe, you and I talked a little bit about this stuff, and it gets personal pretty quick when you look back at history and the fights that we've had to fight on getting chemicals out of commerce to protect our kids. But one of the most egregious, if not the most egregious, was Agent Orange in Vietnam. It took us 30 years to get that dioxin recognized and what it's doing to veterans, what it has done. I've personally lost some buddies to Agent Orange, and you know, this is firefighters. This is, as was said, folks that are running toward the danger. So keep it personal, and we'll get this thing done. Thank you.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Howe yield to a question?
He will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Howe, I think this is an important bill, and I'm a strong supporter of efforts like this. And as you may or may not know, I've been the author of the Toxic Free Kids Act. Last session, as well as this session, we had an opportunity on the floor earlier this year to support legislation very similar to this in some ways. And that was defeated. And there had been pretty valiant efforts by Representative Atkins in particular and others to push this bill forward and really shine a spotlight on the fact that this House was killing a bill that was going to kill chemicals that kill firefighters. And so I think it was very important that we move forward on this basis. One of the reasons that was one of the reasons why I agreed not to offer the Toxic Free Kids Act as an amendment to this bill, because I thought we had to make progress where we could on this important issue. But frankly, this bill in some ways goes further than the Toxic Free Kids Act. The Toxic Free Kids Act only requires manufacturers to report when they're putting toxic chemicals into products that are used by children. This bill bans those products, as I understand it, and studies the potential of banning 6 additional chemicals in the future based on health criteria that are very similar to those health criteria in the Toxic Free Kids Act. So my question is, if we're looking at a bill in the Toxic Free Kids Act that would merely require reporting of the placement of those chemicals in children's products, and today we're willing to move a bill that actually bans those products to protect firefighters, wouldn't we also want to take a step forward to protect children from the same cancer-causing, harmful chemicals that are killing firefighters?
The gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Winkler. Actually, this does ban those in some children's products also. So I think we took an important step towards that piece, and we've got that in here. I am sensitive to the fact that I believe that some of this stuff is possibly tied to some autism problems also. So I'm sensitive to that fact. I can't speak to the reporting piece in your Toxic Free Kids Act. I am very well in tune to what's in this bill after the time I've spent with it, and I think it's an important product of this House, and I appreciate your support.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess I just want to briefly touch on a little bit of a lesson. I'm not going to ask Representative Howe to yield. Just a little bit of a lesson in how the politics of the Minnesota House of Representatives works. Last session, with DFL majorities in the House and Senate and a DFL governor, we couldn't get the Toxic Free Kids Act passed because of the resistance initially of the Minnesota Senate. But finally, at the end, on a weekend like this, when we were getting down to the end, negotiations had to take place on a bonding bill, on a supplemental budget bill, and there were some issues outstanding related to payday lending and toxic-free kids. And it was the signature effort of Minority Leader Doubt at the time that he would find the votes in his caucus for a bonding bill to restore the Capitol and other things, as long as the Democratic leaders agreed to kill the Toxic Free Kids Act and the payday lending bill. So the same bill, as you said, that has similar benefits for kids as this one does for firefighters, was defeated last year. Some of the most powerful industry lobbying groups around were united in opposition, centered on the Chamber of Commerce, the American Chemical Council, the grocery manufacturers, some public companies in Minnesota, including General Mills. All were united in their opposition to a bill that kept harmful chemicals out of the hands of children. This year, that coalition that believes in these chemicals or doesn't care whether they're safe or not was trying again to defeat this, and they almost would have defeated it for the same reasons: greed. Yet again this year. We are fortunate, however, that this year this body apparently believes that firefighters are a more sympathetic group of people to protect than the children across the state. And we are lucky that the politics of protecting firefighters is more powerful than the politics of protecting children, because this bill is finally coming to the floor. Without the firefighters' activism, without the standing out in the hallway, without playing Amazing Grace on the bagpipes, I don't think this bill would be here today, because that same coalition of greed that killed the Toxic Free Kids Act would have successfully killed this bill as well. So congratulations, Representative Howe, on getting this one through. I hope if members have any shred of concern about being in any way consistent in their policy views, and that there's any kind of sense whatsoever that you're actually here to protect the firefighters and not just avoid a political nightmare, then next year you'll decide that that same principle should be used to apply to children, and we could actually get the Toxic Free Kids Act passed with your votes on an amendment on a bill, or you can move it ahead on your own. And if any of you would like to carry that bill and would like to push it through the process and you would like credit for doing it, I'd be more than happy to hand it over to you. Take it. We can name it after you. As I said to Representative O'Driscoll, I will donate to your campaign. I'll do whatever you want in order to get this bill passed. I don't need the credit, but it needs to happen. So if we can do it for firefighters, I don't know why we couldn't do it for kids. Unless, of course, this is just politics.
The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and thank you, Representative Howe, for doing this. And I want to just bring us back for a minute, a comment that I made the other day on the floor about, what really initiated this effort, and it's not just here in Minnesota, but it's across our country. And I just want to remind you that a lot of this work that's in this bill and that was in the original bill came as the result of a study of 30,000 career firefighters, professional firefighters, over the period of 50 years about why they were developing specific types of cancer and what was unique about the work that they did. And the end result is that it was determined that many of the flame retardants that are used in the United States are killing our firefighters. And for many, many years, it became normal, almost accepted for a firefighter to, reach 50, 55, 60, 65 years old, develop cancer, and they die. I can't tell you how many funerals I've been to of my friends and coworkers that have developed, lung cancer, throat cancer, stomach cancer, brain cancer, and you never really know why. I mean, we all have our assumptions, but we just never really know. And this is one of those scenarios where you can almost take your finger and point at certain particular things that we all have in common, that we're all exposed to, that cause cancer. So, well, as disappointed as I am as we don't have our original bill, I know that we're on a right track here. And I think that, as I look at what the Senate did with their version of this bill, it passed, members, 59-2 in the Senate. And I'm not suggesting that we should, model ourselves after what the Senate does, but I think it's a pretty telling story. And I think, we should take that to heart as we come back here next year and do some further work on this bill, because there will be further work on this bill. This is really about protecting employees in their particular workplace, which is unique, I'm sure, to many of you. But, Mr. Speaker, if Representative Howe would yield to a quick question.
The gentleman from Stearns will yield. The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Howe, I just have a question, and I think it's important that we all know and understand this. But you've referenced this process of negotiating this bill as you brought it through committee and were able to bring it here to the floor. And I just think it's important that we understand who it is that you're negotiating with. Who is opposed to the original bill that you had, and who did you have to negotiate with to get it down to these 4 chemicals?
The gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Simonson. It was we had folks on both sides of the fence, and the people, I guess, it would be the we had the Chamber of Commerce, the American Chemistry Council, and the North American Flame Retardant Alliance were on one side, and the firefighters and some of the children's advocacy groups were on the other side. So that's who we were negotiating with, both sides, and I will tell you that I pushed both sides. It wasn't a comfortable position to be in the middle of 2 groups that you're normally working with.
The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Howe. And again, I appreciate your position. I know you're in a difficult position. I don't think that I would have been in quite as difficult a position as you, but that's the differences between your side and my side. But members, I just want to say again, thank you for everybody's effort in bringing this forward. Thank you to Representative Howe. Thank you to the Majority Leader, to Speaker Doubt, and for those that were involved in getting it to this point. And thank you to everybody on this side of the aisle, especially Representative Atkins, for your assistance as well. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I will encourage us all to do a green vote today, and let's hope that we can do some better work when we come back next year.
The lady from Dakota, Representative Halverson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Howe, for working so hard on this. I'm glad that we get a chance to discuss this on the floor. I was in the conference committee when we discussed it, and some very interesting information was shared and confirmed by one of the physicians who was testifying, in that the history of flame retardants in this country doesn't have anything to do with fires, and it has everything to do with cigarettes. It was the tobacco companies that actually created the idea and worked to get mandates that we have flame retardant sofas, flame retardant pajamas for our children, flame retardant mattresses in our house, because they were being pushed, because cigarettes cause so many fires in this country. It's so expensive. And so they were being pushed really, really hard to create a self-extinguishing cigarette. To create what they were considering at the time a safer cigarette, and they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to spend that money. So they created a new council to create these mandates throughout our country and throughout our state. And at the same time, we were having all these conversations about tobacco causing cancer in our country, and we were hearing from the tobacco companies, well, the evidence really isn't in. We need to do more study. We need to spend more time on this. We need to proceed with caution. And while we were all losing our family members. And as Representative Purcell says, this gets personal very, very fast when you're talking about your loved ones, your family, and your heroes. And so as we move forward and as we go forward and support this bill, I want us to commit to the fact that we are not done fighting this fight. And we are not proceeding with caution. We are going to work for the people who are working for us to make sure that they have a safe work environment, and that we are going to continue to fight to get these chemicals out of our homes and make sure that our firefighters are not going to be experiencing the death and destruction of these chemicals any further. So thank you, Representative Howe, for your work.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many things have already been said that I wanted to report to, and I would just say one more thing, and maybe Representative Howe, maybe you'd yield to a question. I understand that there were originally 6 chemicals that were going to be covered in this bill. Is that correct?
The gentleman will yield. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe we had, when the bill first came over, the bill originally had 10, and then we went to, and we negotiated. We identified 3 that weren't really in the products that we were identifying in the scope. So then we were dealing with 7, and now we're down to, we've got 4, so there's 3 that we really need to look at yet, but we got 6 that still need to, that are still there.
Thank you.
The lady from Hennepin.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I know there were the loss of those chemicals, and I think others have already laid out the reasons, people who wanted to water this bill down. And I understand also the other things that were lost out of here were textiles and carpeting. And the date is moved a year ahead before it's going to be effective. But I want to thank you for what you did get done. I think it's an important first step. I'm going to vote for the bill because I think we need that first step. But I hope that you will be a very strong voice along with others of us and some of the organizations that have worked so hard over the years to raise these issues, like the Healthy Legacy organization, who was part of the folks who worked with you. You mentioned advocates on the other side. I just like to give them credit. They've been working on all these issues, including the issues particularly for children. So I'm hoping that you will continue to be very strong working on these issues. And one of the things I would ask you to add to your work on this in the future is that we actually develop the report that that firefighters who die of cancer, that we start tracking that and making sure that we understand that that is a very serious source of cancer in the state of Minnesota. We don't do that at all right now. In fact, we don't do any employment history on people who have cancer, not at all. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I thank you very much for your leadership on this and encourage a green vote, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Dean R.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. In 1992, my son was 6 months old. My father was an on-call fireman for over 25 years. That year, he died at the age of 64 from lung cancer. So I want to thank you, Representative Howe, and I think this is a great start. We need to continue to go forward. We need to continue to protect our firefighters and the dangers that they encounter, and I would ask folks to vote green.
Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Winkler yield to a question?
Representative Winkler will not yield. Oh, the gentleman from Hennepin will yield. Representative Schoen.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler, I just wanted to clarify, because you had brought up Toxic Free Kids Act, and I had actually offered legislation that was even more aggressive than yours, because I wanted labeling so parents would know when they picked up an item what was in the product that their child's toy was made of, since there's chemicals of concern, just like there is in this flame retardants, whether it's in their food packaging or in their toys, that are concerning to cancer-causing agents or otherwise. Were there similar, I missed what you said, were there similar groups that were opposed to keeping safe or keeping chemicals or keeping us unaware of chemicals that are in our children's toys and food packaging as there are that are trying to fight against the flame retardants that are causing cancer in our firefighters?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Schoen, I've not been deeply involved in the negotiations or advocacy around this particular bill, but based on the lobbyists that I saw circling around this issue and huddling together whenever it was before this chamber, my assumption is that they were in fact the same organizations opposed to this one as well.
The gentleman from Washington, Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Howe yield to a question?
The gentleman from Stearns will yield. The gentleman from Washington, Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know one of those, I remember, I think I heard the Chamber, Minnesota State Chamber of Commerce. Is that the Chamber of Commerce you're referring to?
The gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
That's who I negotiated with, yes.
The gentleman from Washington, Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the author continue to yield?
He will yield. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Howe, I think this is an issue that's come up several times now, and we're all watching the clock tick. And the Senate passed a bill with 2 negative votes that was certainly much more restrictive than the bill that you were basically allowed to bring into the chambers. And we've talked. I know you're personally a little bit disappointed that it couldn't be somewhere different than it is today, and that I appreciate the work that you're getting to where we are. This bill is going to have to be confereed. Do we have the time to do that, and what's the plan if we don't? Because this should get done.
The gentleman from Stearns, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Schoen. The author of the bill in the Senate, Senator Marty, will take our language.
The gentleman from Washington, Representative Schoen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so, I guess my statement is that this is good news. At least we'll get somewhere. I'm extremely disappointed that the State Chamber of Commerce has been in here as the one that's able to negotiate this on behalf of whether we're going to protect firefighters or children. And my stepdad was a firefighter, fire chief, small town in greater Minnesota out in Clare City for many, many years. Biggest, toughest guy I ever knew in my life. And now he's in his 70s, has Parkinson's. And we don't know today whether that was connected to it. Representative Howe mentioned links to autism with some of these chemicals. We're talking cancer, all these other nervous system disorders that we don't know about. We can do better than this. We don't come to this chambers and say the almighty dollar is more important than health, because we spend a lot of money on health care in Minnesota, because we think it's important to take care of each other. I'll be supporting this bill begrudgingly, but I wish it was a lot more than what it is, because we should be doing better, not just for firefighters, but for all Minnesotans. Now, I hope next year when we come back that my friends at the Minnesota Professional Firefighters, we're going to get together and we're going to get a bunch of little Johnnies and little Jennies out there, and we're going to put them in turnout gear and little firefighter hats and little bagpipes, and we're going to have them advocate for toxic-free kids and make sure that if that's what we got to do, we'll get mini fire trucks, pedal cars, we'll get them out here when we come back together, and maybe we can get that toxic-free kids and we can protect our children just like we're going to protect firefighters.
Further discussion to the bill? The clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 125 ayes and 6 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The lady from Hennepin, Majority Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I move that the House be allowed to meet past midnight.
Leader Pepin moves that the House be allowed to meet past midnight. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Majority Leader will yield.
She will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If she could just let us know what the plan is for the rest of the evening, when we're going to be coming back from the recess I assume we're going to next.
Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. Yes, my next motion after this will be to recess to the call of the chair so that Ways and Means and other committees can do their work, and we will be coming here at some point later on tonight, and we will give you probably at least a half-hour notice before we come back.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so we're anticipating that people should stay in their offices, you know, say it gets to midnight or 1 o'clock, people should just stay in their offices in order to get back here?
Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. Yes, we are scheduled to adjourn on Monday, and I think that I'd kind of spoken to people before that they should be prepared to be here and to there would be some long breaks, but we do expect that we'll be back here later this evening.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So do you have any idea when so you really don't have any idea right now when we're going to be coming back from recess? That's what you're telling us all, I guess, at this point?
Leader Pepin will yield. Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. I don't have a specific time, but it will be several hours, I think, and I'll keep you informed to the best of my ability.
Gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. And then if the Majority Leader would yield for another question.
She will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we come back, as I understand it, there's no bills on the calendar yet. Are we going, well, I'll ask 2 questions and then you can answer them. Are we going into rules later tonight at all? Do you expect that? And secondly, what are we going to take up when we come back?
Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. I don't think that we'll be going to rules later tonight, and we're looking to see if some conference committees can wrap up.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If Majority Leader would yield for another question.
She will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. Just for planning purposes, do you know what time we'll be coming in tomorrow?
Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. It'll probably be 2.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
And just a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
If we meet past midnight, we have to adjourn at 7 a.m., is that right?
That is correct, Leader Thiessen.
If the Majority Leader will yield for another question.
She will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. What conference committee reports do you anticipate we will be getting back before 7 a.m.?
The Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Thiessen, I don't know yet. We'll keep you, like I said, we'll keep you posted to the best of our ability. I don't have an update on where all the conference committees are. Ways and Means still needs to meet as well. So I'll keep you posted as the best I can commit right now.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Yeah, if she would yield for one more question.
She will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. Have there been any instructions about when conference committees need to be done?
The lady from Hennepin, Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Thiessen. Could you repeat the question?
The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Has leadership given the conference committee any deadlines by which they have to have wrapped up their bills and reached agreement?
The lady from Hennepin, Majority Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. I think they've been given some guidelines so that we can move through the process and be done on time on Monday. I don't have those with me, but they have been given some guidelines.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen. Members, we are on the motion to meet past midnight. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. The gentleman from Sherburne, Chairman Knobloch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the Ways and Means Committee will tentatively meet at 8 o'clock this evening to take up the pension bill, a possible change to the budget resolution, and possibly a bonding bill.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Knobloch yield for a question?
He will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you. Do we, is the plan to come back, one of the things to come back and do a second reading on the pension bill tonight?
The gentleman from Sherburne, Chairman Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Thiessen, I know we want to get the bill here before the legislature this evening so that we can, I would say, have first reading on it. I guess what other plans there are for it, I do not know.
First reading, of course.
Gentleman
yes.
from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if Representative Knobloch would yield for another question.
He will yield.
And can you tell us what the budget resolution changes, the proposed budget resolution changes are going to be?
The gentleman from Sherburne, Chairman Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Thiessen, first of all, I stand corrected. It's a Senate file that we're taking up on the pension bill, so I misspoke there. We have we have a budget resolution amendment that is posted online. I guess I don't recall the exact figure.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Okay, so it's just the one that's posted online. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader Thiessen. The lady from Hennepin, Majority Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I move a recess to the call of the chair.
Leader Pepin moves a recess to the call of the chair. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. We are in recess. To the call.